our agricultural crops are on the front lines of climate change. We can make modifications with the rest of our life, but if our food crops aren't adapted to the climate that we have, we're going to be in deep trouble. So we need to ask ourselves a simple question. Are we prepared? Is our food system prepared for climate change?
Crop diversity is one of the defining issues of our time. It's mankind's most valuable raw material, but its importance is often overlooked, sidelined, or completely ignored. On this week's episode of For Food's Sake, we talk with Dr. Cary Fowler about why crop diversity matters, how seed banks are the world's best insurance policy, and why the Svalbard Global Seed Vault that he helped build is the most important room in the world. My name is Matteo De Vos, and you're listening to For Food's Sake, a podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its impacts on people and planet. Cary has been working to preserve crop diversity for over 4 decades. He's the former executive director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, and he's widely known as the father of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. It's undeniable that Cary is an inspiration to environmentalists and agriculturalists all around the world. He's one of the true biodiversity warriors of our time, a crusader of plant seeds, and yet still crop diversity often remains misunderstood. And so we thought it was only logical to start our conversation there, to define what crop diversity is and why it matters.
People think about diversity in 2 different ways. One is they think of it as a Rousseau painting, where you have a jungle and you have all kinds of critters and creatures roaming around, and there's a diversity of species. But the kind of diversity that I work with is the diversity within species and within genera. It's a diversity that fuels evolution. And I like to tell people that extinction is not an event. It's a process. It's not when the last individual of whatever dies. It's when that species loses the ability to evolve. And how does a species lose the ability to evolve? Well, it loses it by losing diversity. And so if you keep diversity alive, you keep options alive, and those options are what a species, including our food crop species, will need in the future to evolve. So that's the real question. We're really dealing with the raw material of plant evolution, and agriculture just doesn't get a pass for that. And it's not something that most people notice, but it's happening in our food system all the time. I do see more diversity in the supermarkets these days. There are more varieties of apples and such, but and some of those are traditional heirloom varieties, but some of them are modern varieties. And so it might behoove consumers to ask, well, where does a modern variety come from, and how did it come into being, and what was necessary to produce it, both genetically and institutionally? Those are things that most people don't see. It's just invisible to them, but it's obviously critical to our way of life. Most people really don't see much diversity in the grocery stores, not within species diversity, and yet there is a lot out there. We also think that the loaf of bread that we typically buy at the store is just the same as it was 10 or 15 years ago. And almost without fail, it's going to be made from a different variety of wheat. And the reason is that there are new varieties coming on the market that farmers are using every year. And they need new varieties because the environment is changing. The climate is changing. Pests and diseases evolve, mutate, mount better attacks against our food crops. And so plant breeders are using the diversity, all the many different types of and varieties and genes that have that you can find in the gene pool of a particular crop that have evolved over years. They use that diversity to fashion new varieties so that our crops can adapt. And I think, Charles Darwin, I think it was in Origin of Species, said that it's not the strongest or the most intelligent of species that survive, but those most adapted to change. And one of the things that I think is important for people to know is that the rules don't change for agricultural crops. All species have to adapt, and if they don't adapt, they're not going to be obviously successful. And the question for our major agricultural crops, all of our domesticated agricultural crops, is that evolution is in our hands. It's directed evolution. We're responsible for it. And the adaptations don't just fall from the sky magically because we want them, because we need our crops to be adapted. Our crops are adapted because essentially we make them adapted. So crop diversity is the biological foundation for that. And I don't think that you can imagine an agricultural system in the world without the diversity of crops. And obviously we can't imagine human civilization without a functioning agricultural system. So I do think it's the most important natural resource on Earth.
The most important natural resource on Earth. And one thing that is becoming increasingly clear is that this natural resource is under threat. And arguably one of the greatest threats to this crop diversity is the modernization of agriculture. Over the last century or so, crop improvement efforts have often been defined by selecting varieties of crops that have traits that give back the highest return or the highest yield. And this process of selective breeding for traits that we consider particularly desirable has in many ways had a real detrimental impact to the variety of crops that we currently have.
Monsanto finally agreed to buyer's third increased bid of $66 million.
What we're looking at is what it takes in order to serve our customers and the growers better solutions faster to the growers so that they can all contribute to feeding an ever-growing world.
As the science of agriculture advances, the world will be better fed and clothed and housed. You too will reap great harvests.
More productive soils, more useful, more efficient. Agriculture is going far beyond nature to produce new miracles for an even better, more abundant life.
Historically speaking, the biggest threat to crop diversity has been the modernization of agriculture that's taken place, that took place in the 20th century and continues now. Before the rediscovery of Mendel's laws of heredity in 1900, there was really no scientific plant breeding, though I'd hasten to add that farmers were actually quite adept at plant breeding and quite successful at it, but they didn't know the scientific principles that were underlying what they were doing. With Mendel's laws of heredity applied, then you had a rise of scientific plant breeding and the rise of the modern seed companies that promoted that, and the public sector as well. And what they did was they produced modern, as you mentioned, typically more high-yielding varieties, which ended up displacing a lot of the existing diversity, which was usually lower yielding, perhaps more locally adapted or had certain characteristics that obviously local farmers and consumers wanted. It's kind of easy, and a lot of people fall into the trap of trying to find a villain in this story and trying to figure out, well, who are the good guys and the bad guys, and to paint it as a black and white situation. But it's really not that, for a couple of reasons. One is that farmers always make choices that they perceive to be rational for the benefit of their farm and their family and for production and so on. And we want them to do that, don't we? I mean, that's really grassroots decision-making for our agricultural system.
Right.
And we want, globally, we want robust food production. So we want those higher yielding varieties. The downside comes, though, that when you have a system that very efficiently produces these modern varieties, which displace and then essentially drive into extinction the local varieties, all that diversity. If you have a very efficient system for replacing your traditional varieties with new varieties, but you don't have a very efficient system for collecting and conserving those traditional varieties before they're displaced, well, that's when the problem arises. So that's sort of the end of the pipeline that I've been working on.
I think one of the hardest ideas to really wrap your head around is this idea of plant extinction, of crop extinction. Usually when you think of extinction, you have certain ideas that come to mind about certain mammals going extinct or certain birds or certain fish, but when it comes to crop varieties, I think it can be really difficult to get a grasp about what we're talking about here and to get an appreciation really for why it matters to save traditional varieties.
Many of the vegetable varieties and fruit varieties that were grown in the United States in the 1800s are no longer with us. And that's because they were not conserved, and they were, for the most part, replaced by more modern varieties. We've never had a full head count, if you will, of the diversity that's out there in the real world at any given time. We just, there's been no way of making that. So I can't tell you how much of the diversity has been lost, but we have pretty good statistics about the varieties of fruits, vegetables, grains that were grown in the United States in the 1800s. The Patent Office and the USDA made such surveys, and we know that the great majority of those varieties can no longer be found in commercial production, in seed banks, in any kind of conservation program. So we assume that they're extinct. Every once in a while, we find a variety that we thought was extinct but isn't. I found one myself, an old apple variety named Magnum Bonum, and there have been others, people that, particularly in the apple world, that have been out there scouring the country for these old varieties. But many of the varieties are just gone, and what that means is, it means a couple of things. One is, if you think of a variety as being a particular unique combination of traits, then we've lost that particular unique combination of traits, and that it's very hard to reconstruct that in any kind of precision. And that's a loss in a lot of ways. It's a loss historically and culturally and aesthetically and in culinary terms and such. Many of these varieties have been handed down for generations after generations of our ancestors, and they made it all that way because they had good qualities, because our ancestors valued something about them. And then all of a sudden, for reasons that may not be rational, they're gone. The other thing that's important about it is that varieties are very often not just a particular combination of, let's say, common traits that individually might be found in other varieties, but sometimes they have unique traits. Sometimes a particular variety has a trait that no other variety has. So losing that variety means that you've lost the trait. And that means that's really important, because that means you no longer have access to that option for the future for that entire food crop. And that's where you get into a really dangerous situation and why we need to conserve this diversity. I'm sitting here looking at an old drawing of the Anso pear. And this is an extinct pear variety. And I tell this story often, but I think it makes the point. It was described in an old book on pears, which was sort of the authoritative book on pears in the early part of the 20th century, as being the pear that was most aptly termed buttery.
Buttery.
Buttery, a buttery pear taste. And I thought, wow, that sounds great. But there's a variety that's been lost and obviously had a really delicious, intriguing, enticing kind of taste quality to it. So we won't see that again, and we wouldn't know it if we did, I suppose. So anyway, that's gone, and to me, that's sad, particularly when it doesn't take a lot of effort to conserve that diversity. But we'll talk about that later.
Where crop diversity is most important, according to Cary, is in helping us face an uncertain future.
I think of climate change as being the single biggest challenge we have in our agricultural systems now looking forward. And we're really facing an unprecedented combination of challenges these days. It's climate change, it's also water, it's also nutrients. We have huge challenges about availability and pricing of all of those things. But I think climate change is and global warming in particular is going to provide a more complex set of challenges than most people imagine. Most people think, well, if the planet is getting warmer, that means that we can just move production, in this hemisphere up north a little bit. So maybe if my ancestors in the past, relatives today, were growing cotton down in Tennessee, well, maybe we'll grow it in Illinois in the future or whatever. It's not so simple. Our crops are adapted to particular environments, which include a lot more than just the average temperature. And what climate change is going to give us is obviously higher averages. We're seeing that every year. But also higher extremes, longer periods of extreme weather, changes in seasonality. So our existing crop varieties may be out of sync in terms of their germination with the new seasonality. We're going to have hotter weather at very inconvenient times, such as flowering for our crops. And the other thing it's going to do is, and we can already see it, is that virtually all species are on the move now. The natural range of virtually everything is changing. And that means that the farm where I live here now in the Hudson Valley in New York is going to be seeing new pests, new insects, new diseases coming in. And this is going to put our crops into an environment with historically unprecedented combinations of species. It's like, opening up the gates at a zoo and just having everything file out and roam around together. We don't know what's going to happen. And I suspect that not all of the surprises are going to be good ones. So we have to be prepared for this, which is going to be very daunting. And again, I come back to crop diversity providing the options for the kind of surprises that I think are on the way.
One of the ways that we can save this diversity, this crop diversity, is through seed banks. Seed banks are a type of gene bank that stores seeds to preserve genetic diversity.
Modern seed bank probably traces back to a Russian scientist named Nikolai Vavilov in the teens, who started collecting material all over the world and bringing it back to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and started probably the first real global collection of seeds. And since then, most countries have started their own seed banks. As I said, ours is in Fort Collins, Colorado. And, there are some also a network of international agricultural research centers called CGIR that are maintaining some of the biggest and best and most used collections of our major food crops. But that system really, though it started maybe in the teens or 20s, really took hold in the 1970s when scientists and governments became convinced, I think, that the Green Revolution, the modernizing of agriculture, really was having an impact on the loss of genetic diversity in agriculture. So there were very concerted efforts from the 1970s onward to collect and conserve this diversity.
I was also curious to know how well we're doing in identifying traits that are crucial to conserve to combat climate change. Are we able to identify different traits that can be advantageous in different climate change scenarios?
When seeds go into a seed bank, very often the researchers there will test those. They'll screen them against whatever pests, diseases, other qualities are today most interesting. But very few seed banks, including our national one in Fort Collins, Colorado, here in the States, are really adequately funded. So essentially, we're sitting on a gigantic library, nature's library of life for our domesticated crops. But we don't have a complete card catalog. We don't know all of the qualities that are in those seeds that we're conserving. So we have a long way to go in terms of generating more information about what we have. But yes, we do. Having said that, we still do know quite a lot about quite a lot of the samples that we are conserving.
That's interesting. I guess one of the main problems we see today, though, with seed banks is that, like you mentioned, they can be incredibly vulnerable, right? In the sense that even though we're increasing our efforts to preserve seeds and do as much as we can, at least nationally, a lot of those seed banks are just, subject to human error, to catastrophes, to wars, to what have you. And I guess that's one of the problems we're seeing today.
Yes. Well, in your introductory remarks, you mentioned that I've been working in this area for 40 years, and that's given me a chance to see quite a lot. In the 1990s, I was asked by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization to come to Rome and head up a multi-year project which would assess the state of the world's plant genetic resources for agriculture. And the staff and I there found a simply an alarming, deplorable situation in many of the world's seed banks. We didn't find then, and we wouldn't find today, right now, a single seed bank in the world that was adequately and sustainably funded. So, there are very few, if any, seed banks that even rate a line item in a national budget. They're sort of hidden within the budget of a department or ministry, and thus vulnerable to budget cuts. And you can't have a long-term conservation program if you that's at the whim of politics and this year's round of budget negotiations. You can't conserve seed 49 out of the next 50 years is not quite good enough. So that's just one factor. And of course, but it's a huge one, because budget cuts, which we see in the United States and in other countries, lead to all kinds of things. They lead to poor maintenance of the equipment. They lead to poor recruitment of qualified staff and poor retention of those staff. They lead to the roof leaking and all kinds of things, that all of which endanger the seeds that are in their care. So this is an international tragedy, and it's a nonpartisan tragedy, by the way, or problem in the United States. We've had bipartisan benign neglect for many years. And it's remarkable because, we wouldn't think of having an art museum and defunding the security for the art museum, would we?
Right.
And yet we have the Goyas and the Rembrandts and the Picassos of the plant world in our seed banks. And they're even more important than those paintings, because they're what's helping us produce the next generation of Rembrandts and Picassos. And yet, in a sense, very often through modest but very important budget cuts, we withdraw the security at night and allow these treasures to be stolen away from us.
And it's not like it's incredibly difficult. I mean, in terms of what it takes concretely to store these seeds and to keep them under conditions that allow us to preserve them for generations. I mean, in concrete terms, what do we need to do? I mean, it's essentially a massive freezer, right?
Yeah, you need a freezer. You've got one in your kitchen, and it functions well enough to be a seed bank. Because it delivers a temperature that's quite appropriate to long-term conservation of seeds. And you would think that wouldn't be too complicated for governments to get their heads around, but in fact, it is. Of course, to have a seed bank is a little more complicated than that, but essentially, for the crops that can be conserved long-term as seed, not all can. But for those crops, you're operating a freezer, and you need to dry the seed. You need to reduce the moisture content, which reduces the biological activity or slows down the biological activity in the seed. And you need to freeze it, which does the same thing. And if you dry it and you freeze it, seed of most of our crops will be viable for decades, hundreds of years, and a number of cases of our important food grains, thousands of years. But of course, you need a staff to do that. You need processing them. They need to put clean, fresh, healthy seed into the seed bank. You want people to screen those samples so we know what kind of traits and qualities that they have, and you have to have a database so that that becomes visible and accessible to the researchers and plant breeders that need it. So it's a little more involved than your kitchen freezer, but still, it's actually a very very cheap kind of enterprise. It doesn't involve any kind of technology that we don't already have. So no pie in the sky. Well, maybe we can do that if we invent such and such. No, we know everything we need to know pretty much about how to save most of the seeds of most of the species we're dealing with, and the cost-benefit ratio is astronomical. Probably the biggest payoff of anything that government does. So, but is it a sexy thing? When was the last time that a person in Congress or senator got a letter from a constituent saying this is an important thing for you to pay attention to? When was the last time anyone even visited our national seed bank?
I guess this is where the Global Crop Diversity Trust that I know you worked at as the executive director for I think 7 years, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's where they play an important role, right, in being one of the, if not the only organization worldwide that's working to fund and manage an efficient system of seed collection and seed banks.
Right. Well, the Global Crop Diversity Trust, which was headquartered in Rome, Italy, when I headed it, and since his move to Bonn, Germany, really is the only organization that's set up to do what it's doing, and that is to assemble an endowment fund that would generate funding so that we could conserve reliably these collections every year, not just most of the years. And it's also charged with helping to develop a rational, efficient global system. And I know all those words, all those adjectives are sort of throwaway adjectives, but it really does mean something in our field, because if you had an endowment fund that was generating income and you wanted to use that to conserve all the seed diversity in the seed banks around the world, you could imagine that unless you had some controls over that, some criteria, that, I don't know, the number of seed banks could double tomorrow or triple. And it would turn into an entitlement program, and every country would be saying, hey, we've got seeds, send us money. So we've tried at the Crop Trust to figure out what a truly rational, efficient, and sustainable system would look like. And it really involves making sure that the unique diversity on Earth is housed in an efficient and an efficiently managed facility and financed properly, with a backup collection, at least one backup collection, our insurance policy being the Svalbard Global Seed Vault.
The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, it's the world's largest collection of agricultural biodiversity. I knew you were instrumental. I mean, you're very much coined the father of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Could you tell us a little bit about how that vault came about and your involvement with it?
Yeah, sure. I was working with some other people to try to, in an effort to upgrade some of the international seed banks around the world, nonprofit institutions that have some of the biggest and best and most used seed collections in the world. And we've gotten a large grant to upgrade equipment and such amongst these 10 or so seed banks. And we're feeling pretty good about that. I was working a lot with Henry Shands, who at that point was the head of the U.S. National Seed Bank in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we felt pretty satisfied that these seed banks were at operating at a very high international standard level. And yet, when we looked at them, we realized that they were located in some places that either were or had been dangerous locations. Places that like Colombia and Peru and Nigeria and Benin and Cote d'Ivoire and Philippines, and many of these, and Syria, and many of these places had experienced armed conflict. And obviously, you don't want a seed bank in such an unstable situation. So we realized that having a good facility, a solid roof over your head, and great equipment inside really wasn't enough to secure this diversity. And we were working in the context, I have to say, of 9/11, which raised the question of what building on Earth is safe, and Hurricane Katrina. And it was Katrina, I think, that really, that was an important point for us, because we were sitting there, Henry and I, talking about the fact that that there were a lot of accusations thrown around after Katrina that the scientists, the experts, knew that sooner or later a Force 5 hurricane would hit New Orleans, and they knew if it did that the levees wouldn't hold, and therefore the city would be flooded and it'd be a huge catastrophe. So what did they do about it? There's always a they. What did they do about it? And Henry and I realized that that we were they. We we were who they would be talking about. So what were we going to do about it? And we thought, well, we need a really safe place to put this diversity as a backup. We need a great plan B, and it has to be someplace that's far away from the normal dangers of the earth, and it ought to be cold, so that if the equipment goes on the blink, the seeds will remain frozen. And we knew that the Nordics had a project up in Svalbard where they had put a backup copy and were doing some research on some of their seed varieties from the Nordic gene bank, which was located in Sweden at the time. And I had an appointment as a professor at the Agricultural University of Norway, so I was on site and I was very familiar with all these things. And we thought, well, maybe we should just write a letter to Norway and ask them if they'd look into the feasibility of establishing a seed vault in Svalbard near the North Pole. And we did that. I drafted the letter, and a representative of these other research institutions signed it. It went to Norway, and a week or two later, I was sitting at my desk at the university, and I got a call from the foreign ministry, and they informed me that they had gotten a letter about looking into the feasibility of establishing a seed vault. And they wanted to appoint a committee to look into this because it was a very prestigious group of research institutions, and so they felt like they had to answer them. And they were asking me to chair the committee, and that's when I said, well, there's a conflict of interest because I wrote the letter. And the fellow on the other end of the phone said, oh, yeah, we know that. But do you know the answer to your own question? Is it feasible? And I said, no, I really don't know the answer to that question. And he said, great, you're the chairman of the committee. Get the answer. And the answer was, looking into the feasibility of doing it meant that we actually had to come up with a plan, with a design for this facility, with a management plan, with the estimate of the cost, with all those kinds of things. And then we had to take a step backwards and say, okay, here's the best plan we can come up with. Will the best plan work? So we did all that, and we concluded that, yes, it would work. And then we also made a legal and political assessment. In other words, is it legally feasible, not just technically feasible? And would there be any political problems, and would countries actually use it? And we decided that it was a go. And we went to the foreign ministry and told them the results of our feasibility study and that we were recommending that Norway do this. And much to my surprise and a little bit to my horror at the time, because it was intimidating, Norway said yes. And I was really, really surprised. And I want to stop here and say that I give a lot of credit to the government of Norway, because I will tell you that when this happened, this was 2004, there was no seed vault anywhere in the world, certainly nothing near the North Pole inside of a mountain. And there were a lot of people in my field, including a whole bunch of friends of mine, that thought it was one totally wacko idea. Wild and crazy and would never work. And I think that one of the most interesting things is that, governments are always risk averse. No government wants to be embarrassed by doing something crazy. And certainly not something that has long-term consequences like this and is geared for such a long time horizon. So Norway was, they were concerned about how they would be perceived and whether scientists around the world would say it was a crazy idea. but they were convinced that something like this needed to happen. And as I think most of us know about Norway, they're very much thinking towards the future, and they very much think about the common good, and they're a nation that values international cooperation. And so they took the risk. They said yes, and they funded it completely, 100%. And I don't know of any other country that would have been trusted to do it or would have done it. So hats off to them.
That's quite incredible, and especially now when you look at, how far it's come, and the fact that every country on Earth has some seeds stored in the vault, to my understanding. And I mean, I can't really think of anywhere else on a global scale that there's been that much cooperation in the last couple of centuries, to put it mildly.
No, I can't. I think we have seeds that at least originated, when they were collected from 234 countries, and that includes a bunch of countries that no longer exist. We're missing seeds from a couple of places that are officially countries, so we don't have any seeds from the Vatican, and I don't think we have any seeds from Nauru out in the Pacific, but we've got seeds from almost everywhere else.
That's quite incredible. And could you tell us a little bit? I'm fascinated. I think a lot of people are too, and some of your books too. Your book Seeds on Ice has a lot of incredible pictures of Svalbard and of the vault. I know that it's off limits, obviously, to the public, but could you describe maybe the feeling, especially for you, and how involved you've been, the feeling, I guess, of going in there and what it represents, and the surroundings? Svalbard looks like an incredible place.
Well, Svalbard is just one of the most beautiful spots on Earth, and it has a landscape which is unique. It's just highly unusual, strange-looking mountains, incredible light. You're at the top of the world, and the colors in the sky are like nothing you've ever seen before. I've hosted a number of photographers, National Geographic and others up there, and I'll tell them beforehand, well, you've never seen light like this. You've never seen this kind of color, and I can imagine the thoughts that are running through their mind on the other end of the phone. What does this guy know? He's not a National Geographic photographer. And then they get off the plane, and their eyes are like saucers, and they say to me, "Cary, I've never seen light like this." So it is a remarkably beautiful place, and it's an austere setting. There are no farms on Svalbard. There are no trees or shrubs. There are no gardens. I've never even seen a potted plant on anybody's doorstep. There's a small, mostly Norwegian village there of about 2,000 people. Great infrastructure. And the facility itself was built in a very pragmatic way. It's many people would think that when you open the door, you're going to walk into some kind of pristine, high-tech laboratory. But that's not at all how we designed it. We built a tunnel that's about 130 yards long, and at the end of that are 3 rooms, and we're currently storing seeds in one of those rooms. The outside is of the facility, what you see from the outside is a small, what we call a portal building. It's really a kind of a wedge that sticks out of the mountain. It's got an artistic light fixture at the top. In Norway, if you spend a certain amount of money, I forget exactly how much, but not much, on a building or even a road construction thing, you are required by law to allocate a certain percentage to artwork. Oh. So the artwork for this facility is this beautiful light installation that's on the front and wraps over the top of this facility. And there are double doors on this portal building, and if you were to open those doors and open the other doors that lead down this straight tunnel all the way to the back, you'd be be looking down a tunnel of about 130 yards. We designed it to be simple and workable. We didn't want things that could break or things that could cause accidents like staff. So we designed a facility that largely runs without staff. There's no permanent staff on site. And it's naturally frozen. We artificially lower it down to an even better temperature. So we go from about 20, I'm thinking in Celsius, so about -5, which I think is about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, to -3 Fahrenheit, -18 Celsius. And we do that mechanically. But other than that, we have a couple of thousand boxes of seeds on the shelf, and we don't need a staff there to watch seeds freeze.
And how many seeds are currently saved there at the moment?
Well, in terms of seeds, probably something over 500 million.
Wow.
But we have about 500 seeds per sample, somewhere between 400 and 500 seeds per sample, sometimes a bit more. And we have samples of almost 931,000 different crop varieties. And that would include more than 150,000 different kinds of rice and more than 150,000 different kinds of wheat. Those are the two most represented crops in the seed vault.
And so the way it works is that you can, as a nation state that's put your seeds there, you have access to it whenever you need. It's like how exactly does it work? It's a deposit system?
Yes, it works exactly like the safety deposit box at the bank works for you. Norway owns the facility. It's a Norwegian mountain, but the depositor owns their seeds. So when a depositor makes a deposit, and most of the time it's a national seed bank. We have a few universities have made deposits. We have a couple of non-government organizations, including Seed Savers Exchange in the United States, that have made deposits, and a few international research institutions that have made deposits. And when they do that, we sign a contract with them. And the contract essentially says that we're going to take care of your seeds free of charge. We claim no physical property ownership over your seeds or any intellectual property rights over your seeds. You send us the box of your seeds. We will not open the box, and we will provide access to those seeds only to you and only on your request. We can't be dispensing seeds to researchers and individuals, plant breeders and such from the North Pole. That would obviously be untenable and unsustainable. So we really function as an insurance policy and as a safety deposit box for other seed collections around the world. And I should say that in the same way that we're an insurance policy for them, they're an insurance policy for us with the seed vault, because something could go wrong with the seed vault. Mm-hmm. I think it's highly improbable, but nothing's impossible in this world. So if we were to lose the seed vault, we would still have a copy of all of those samples in the other working active seed banks around the world.
And has any particular nation state had to use their deposit, so to speak, so far? Has there been?
We've had one withdrawal. I think we're going to have more unfortunately in the near future. But we've had one, and it was a major one. When Arab Spring started, I got on the phone with a friend of mine who was the director general of a research station that was located outside of Aleppo, Syria. This is an organization called ICARTA, the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, quite an acronym, ICARTA. And they had one of the world's major collections of wheat, barley, lentils, chickpea, fava beans, and a wonderful little crop that I like called grass pea. And this was an institution. It was not Syrian national institution, but international, nonprofit. They had major global collections of all those crops that I just named, and they were one of the principal plant breeders for farmers of those crops for the Mideast. But they also, out of their seed bank, supplied researchers all over the world, and their seed bank was very much oriented towards, in their breeding programs, towards agriculture for semi-arid and arid areas of the world. And given climate change, there are researchers all over the world that want access to materials that to traits that make crops more adapted to low water and high heat conditions. So this is a globally important facility. And it was just outside of Aleppo, Syria. Charming, wonderful, beautiful, historic city with very friendly people. I've visited many times and just always loved going there. And then we started to have a war in Syria, and you can go on the internet now and see what's happening to Aleppo. We did manage to get that seed collection out of or at least copies of it out of Syria and up to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault before all hell broke loose in Aleppo. And about a year and a half ago, the institutes had to reestablish themselves, and that institute reestablished itself in Morocco and Lebanon. And about a year and a half ago, the scientists, realizing that they weren't going back to Aleppo anytime soon, said, "Well, we need our seeds back now." So we shipped those seeds back. We shipped a portion of what they had sent us back. We shipped about 30,000 samples. They had sent us 100,000, but they couldn't process 100,000 all at once. So they took 30,000, and what they did was they used those seeds to grow, plants and to harvest fresh new seed in large quantity, and they kept part of that seed to reestablish their seed bank and to fuel their plant breeding programs. And just in this past February, they sent us part of that new seed back to Svalbard. Obviously, they understand the importance of having an insurance policy, so they wanted very quickly to get a sample back to Svalbard. So that really averted quite a catastrophe that most people wouldn't know about, would never make it to the front page of any newspaper, but really has, I think, some historic importance in terms of our agricultural system. And I think, looking forward, we're going to have more cases like that. When we first established the Seed Vault, I was on the phone and visiting and talking to, in the first instance, seed bank managers of the big, important seed banks, the ones that had the most diversity. And because we wanted to get as much diversity into the Seed Vault as possible, as quickly as possible. Mm. But now we're beginning to work with some of the smaller seed banks around the world, some of the smaller developing country seed banks. And those collections are coming in. And typically those are the most vulnerable collections because of budget cuts and all kinds of natural disasters and civil strife and such. And so I'm guessing in the future we'll have more instances of where we have to use the Seed Vault to repatriate and reestablish collections. It's always a sad thing. It's bittersweet, right?
Right.
Seed Vault is an insurance policy, and whether it's a car insurance or health insurance, you just never want to use an insurance policy. Exactly.
It's a last resort, but at least it's a last resort that you have.
Yes, and before we didn't have it. So before, those of us in this field were simply waiting for catastrophes to happen and watching. And We were spectators, and we were spectators to extinction. And that just simply seems untenable and unacceptable these days, particularly in the context of the kind of challenges that agriculture will have to adapt to in the future.
That's very true. I'm glad that there's people out there that are no longer spectators and active participants in the change that we need to see. And on that point, I mean, myself and I'm sure a lot of listeners would think that we still very much, as outsiders, not having directly worked with the vault and not directly working with these seed banks, we might still feel like spectators. And so this brings me on to, I guess, my next question, which is, as individuals, what can we do to help this movement or this idea of seed saving? Is our way of contributing to saving seeds done best through seed saving organizations, or perhaps through helping fund different banks or raising awareness? What do you think the ordinary average Joe can do to do his or her bit in this movement?
That's always the toughest question I get, and it's tough because I don't know each and every one of your listeners as individuals. So what might be right for one person wouldn't be right for another. The field I work in is a fairly small field, and we don't need a cast of thousands to do what we're doing. So one doesn't necessarily have to be hands-on in this field to make a contribution. If you feel like you want to be hands-on, there are a lot of ways you can do that. You can join Seed Savers Exchange, seedsavers.org. You can conserve your own threatened heirloom varieties. You can do those kinds of things. And there's plenty of room for that, and it really does make a contribution. Awareness building, absolutely. I said earlier that I don't think there have been very many politicians that there are not many politicians that know about or understand this issue. Very few have visited the National Seed Bank. And obviously, if you have that kind of situation, you have a facility in our own country that is vulnerable and, in fact, in recent years has gotten budget cuts. So that's, write your congressperson and your senator. They won't be expecting to hear from you on this topic. So it carries a lot more weight than if you're writing about one of the hot button issues of today. Mm. But I think more than that, I've always seen this work to conserve diversity as part of a larger picture of working for food security and working for justice in the world and working for poverty alleviation and development. So I think that anything anyone wants to do in those areas is complementary to the kind of topic and that we've been talking about today. And it's going to be, one can even start with the issue of climate change. We definitely need a government that doesn't just believe in climate change, but understands it.
Amen.
And values the science. We value science in so many areas in this country. I think this is one that we need to get on board with. And what that means in practical terms is that and one of the reasons, to go back to the beginning of our discussion, that I think that the Seed Vault is essentially the most important room in the world because it's conserving the most important resource in the world. Our agricultural crops are on the front lines of climate change. We can make modifications with the rest of our life, but if our food crops aren't adapted to the climate that we have, we're going to be in deep trouble. So we need to ask ourselves a simple question. Are we prepared? Is our food system prepared for climate change? I think the answer is no. I think we could be prepared. But needing to be prepared and wanting to be prepared is not the same thing. We need to organize ourselves to really be prepared, and that means a lot of different things. It means offering. It means supplying the pipeline of the next generation of scientific researchers and plant breeders. It means funding our seed bank properly. It means completing the endowment of the Global Crop Diversity Trust. It means working cooperatively with other countries to screen and test and share these genetic resources, which really are a common heritage of mankind. It means all of those things. And I know those are all esoteric sounding things that people in my field might talk about, but people walking down the street don't have a clue about. But these are all important things to meet what I think is the greatest challenge that our way of life and our civilization and our countries face today. So maybe it behooves us to become a little bit more educated about this and to become more involved.
I couldn't agree more. That's hope what I'm trying to do with this podcast as well is let people know about the issues out there and try and engage people working in the field, so to speak, and trying to raise awareness.
Well, I love what you're doing, and you do it in a very thoughtful, informed, and civil manner. And I'm not sure those things are in fashion right now, but I like them.
Well, thank you, Cary. I very much appreciate that, and I really appreciate you coming on the show today. It's an absolute pleasure. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a real fan of your work and everything that you're doing and the stance that you take. Is there any last words you have for our listeners out there? Maybe a message of hope after all the problems that we're facing. I think that's something we definitely all need.
Well, maybe I'll say this. When I got involved in this issue, I got involved out of concern and passion, but I was an interloper. I was coming to this field from the outside without the proper academic credentials or anything like that. And what I think I've learned along the way, 40 years later, is that persistence, or in my case, stubbornness, can sometimes pay off. So I would just say to all of your listeners, don't be deterred. There's something that everybody can do. Individuals really can make a difference. You just need to come down out of the stands and get on the playing field.
I'd like to just leave you there with Dr. Cary Fowler's thoughts and give you some time to reflect and think about it. And if you want any further information, you can, as always, find all the details in the show notes below. I'll see you next time.